Grace Valenti stood before the dusty mirror in her modest boarding house room, pinning back a few errant strands of auburn hair that had escaped her practical bun. At 32, the fine lines around her eyes told stories of both laughter and hardship, a life lived fully if not always easily. The year was 1878, and Calico, California was booming with silver mining prosperity and with men who wanted wives young enough to bear many children and docile enough not to question their husband's authority. "Miss Valenti, there's mail for you," called Mrs. Wilcox from downstairs. The boarding house owner's voice carried easily through the thin walls of the two-story wooden structure. Grace descended the narrow staircase, her plain but well-kept navy blue skirt rustling against the steps. After 4 years of teaching in Calico's schoolhouse, she had earned the respect of the townsfolk, if not exactly the romantic interest of eligible men. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilcox." Grace accepted the envelope, recognizing her sister's handwriting immediately. She tucked it into her pocket to read later, then gathered her teaching materials. The morning bell would ring soon. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple one-room building that served the children of miners, merchants, and ranchers alike. As Grace approached, she noticed a commotion near the general store. A group of cowboys, trail-worn and dust-covered, had arrived in town. New faces always stirred excitement in Calico, especially when they belonged to able-bodied men looking for work. Grace hurried past, conscious of their gazes following her. She caught snippets of their conversation as she walked. "New schoolteacher. Nah, been here a while. Pretty enough but a bit long in the tooth for marrying. Heard she's over 30. Grace felt her cheeks burn but kept her posture straight and her eyes forward. Their words weren't anything she hadn't heard before. In this part of the country, most women were married by 20, mothers shortly thereafter. At 32, she was considered firmly on the shelf. The school day passed as it typically did, reading lessons for the younger children, arithmetic for the older ones, and a geography lesson for all 12 students. When the final bell rang, Grace gathered her things and locked the schoolhouse door. She was halfway back to the boarding house when she realized she'd left her sister's letter on her desk. With a sigh, she turned around, the setting sun casting long shadows across the rutted dirt road. As she approached the schoolhouse, she noticed one of the cowboys from earlier leaning against the hitching post, hat in hand. He straightened when he saw her, revealing himself to be tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. What caught her attention most were his eyes, a warm amber color that seemed to reflect the sunset. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice deeper than she expected. "Didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't," Grace replied, though her quickened pulse suggested otherwise. "I've just forgotten something inside. Name's Yates, Yancy Yates." He smiled, revealing a small gap between his front teeth that somehow added charm to his rugged appearance. "Just rode in with some cattle from Nevada." "Miss Grace Valenti," she replied formally. "I'm the schoolteacher here." "I know. The folks at the Mercantile told me." He shifted his weight, seeming uncharacteristically nervous for a man of his stature. "I was wondering if you might need an escort back to town after you retrieve your belongings. Sun's getting low." Grace hesitated. Calico was generally safe, but a woman alone after dark was never the wisest proposition. Still, she'd been taking care of herself for years. "That's very kind, Mr. Yates, but just Yancy, please." His smile deepened. "And it's no trouble. I was heading that direction anyhow." Something in his earnest expression made Grace nod. "Very well. I'll only be a moment." Inside the schoolhouse, Grace quickly located her sister's letter but paused before returning outside. Through the window, she could see Yancy patting his horse's neck, speaking softly to the animal. There was a gentleness to his movements that contradicted his rugged appearance. When she emerged, he offered to walk alongside her rather than having her ride with him, a courtesy that surprised her. "How long have you been teaching in Calico, Miss Valenti?" he asked as they made their way back toward town. "4 years now. I came west after my parents passed. My sister had already settled in San Francisco. 4 years. That's a commitment to a place like this." "I enjoy it," Grace said, finding herself wanting to explain. "The children need education if they are to have opportunities beyond the mines and ranches." "A noble cause," he nodded approvingly. "I never had much schooling myself. Can read and cipher well enough, but that's about the extent of it." "That's more than many," Grace replied. "Are you staying in Calico long?" "Depends." He glanced at her sideways. "Might be looking to settle somewhere, getting tired of the constant moving." They reached the boarding house steps too quickly for Grace's liking. Their conversation had flowed easily without the awkwardness she often felt around men. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Yates Yancy," she corrected herself. "My pleasure, Miss Valenti." He replaced his hat. "Perhaps I'll see you around town." "Perhaps you will." She smiled and entered the boarding house, aware of Mrs. Wilcox's curious gaze from the parlor window. Later that evening, as Grace finally opened her sister's letter, she found herself distracted by thoughts of amber eyes and a gap-toothed smile. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the desert air already warming as Grace made her way to the schoolhouse. She'd nearly convinced herself that her encounter with Yancy Yates was unremarkable when she spotted him outside the general store, deep in conversation with several local ranchers. He tipped his hat when he saw her, and she acknowledged him with a nod before continuing on her way, inexplicably pleased by the simple gesture. At midday, while her students ate their lunches in the schoolyard, Grace was surprised to see Yancy approaching, a small package tucked under one arm. "Good day, Miss Valenti," he called. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," she replied, conscious of the curious stares from her pupils. "The children are having their lunch break." He looked at the watching children and gave them a friendly wave. Several of the boys waved back enthusiastically. "I brought something for your students." He handed her the package. "Slate pencils. Shopkeeper said the school might be running low." Grace unwrapped the brown paper to find 24 perfectly good slate pencils. Such a thoughtful gift, and one the school budget would have strained to provide. "This is very kind, Mr. Yates. The children will be delighted. Figure education's important, like you said." He shuffled his boots in the dust. "And I was hoping maybe you might join me for supper at the hotel dining room tonight. If you're not otherwise engaged, that is." Grace felt a flutter of surprise and pleasure at the invitation. That would be lovely. 6 o'clock suit you?" His smile broadened when she nodded. "I'll call for you at the boarding house." As he walked away, Grace became aware of giggles behind her. She turned to find her older female students watching with undisguised interest. "Is that your beau, Miss Valenti?" asked 12-year-old Sarah Miller. "Certainly not," Grace replied with what she hoped was appropriate teacherly dignity. "Mr. Yates is new to town and merely being neighborly." "My pa says he's buying the old Jenkins place," volunteered Thomas Cooper. "Says he's got money from gold mining up north." Grace shooed them back to their lunches, wondering about the truth of Thomas's statement. Was Yancy planning to stay in Calico permanently? That evening, Grace stood before her mirror again, this time with greater attention to her appearance. She'd changed from her teaching clothes into her one good dress, a dark green that complemented her auburn hair and fair skin. The cut was modest but flattering, with a lace collar that softened the severity of her usual style. When Mrs. Wilcox called up that her gentleman caller had arrived, Grace took a steadying breath. It had been years since she'd been courted, if that's what this was. At 32, she'd long ago accepted that marriage might not be in her future, focusing instead on her teaching career. Yancy waited in the parlor, looking remarkably different in clean clothes, his hair still damp from what must have been a recent bath. He stood when she entered, his eyes widening appreciatively. "Miss Valenti, you look beautiful," he said with such sincerity that Grace couldn't help but believe him. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Yates." Mrs. Wilcox hovered nearby, clearly pleased by this development. "Don't keep Miss Valenti out too late, Mr. Yates." "She has school tomorrow." "Yes, madam," Yancy replied seriously, though a twinkle in his eye told Grace he found the admonishment amusing. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Calico, which wasn't saying much by San Francisco standards but represented luxury in the mining town. White tablecloths covered the tables, and a piano player provided gentle background music. Several heads turned as they entered, and Grace felt the weight of curious stares. It wasn't every day that Calico's schoolteacher dined with a newcomer. "I hope I haven't made you uncomfortable," Yancy said quietly as they were seated. "Small towns have long memories and longer tongues." "I'm quite used to being the subject of gossip," Grace replied. "When I first arrived, there was much speculation about why a woman would choose to teach rather than marry." "And what did you tell them?" "That not all women are fortunate enough to find suitable partners, and that teaching provides both purpose and independence." Yancy nodded thoughtfully. "A fair answer, though I suspect many men were simply intimidated by an educated woman." Grace studied him over her menu. "And you're not intimidated, no." His eyes met hers. "Impressed, certainly." Their conversation flowed easily through dinner, touching on his experiences driving cattle across the Western Territories, her childhood in Pennsylvania, and their mutual love of good books. Grace found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn in by Yancy's stories and his genuine interest in her opinions. "Young Thomas Cooper mentioned you might be purchasing property near town," she said as they shared apple pie for dessert. "News travels fast," Yancy chuckled. "Yes, I've made an offer on the Jenkins Ranch. 15 years of cattle driving has left me with enough savings to start my own place, and I'm ready to put down roots." "It's a beautiful property," Grace said. "The Jenkins family was devastated by the influenza last winter." "So I heard." "Seems a shame to let good land go to waste." He paused. "The house needs work, but it's solid, big enough for a family." There was a question in his statement that Grace wasn't ready to address. She changed the subject. "Will you raise cattle, some, and horses? I've always had a way with horses." His expression grew more serious. "Miss Valenti, Grace, I hope you don't find me too forward, but I'd very much like to call on you again." "I would like that," she replied honestly. As they walked back to her boarding house in the cool evening air, Yancy offered his arm and Grace took it, aware of the warmth of him even through his coat sleeve. "I should warn you," she said suddenly, "that some might consider me too old for courting." Yancy stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression earnest in the moonlight. "Grace, I'm 36 years old. I've spent my life moving from place to place, never staying long enough to build anything lasting. Now that I'm ready to settle down, I'm not looking for some young girl who doesn't know her own mind. I want a woman who knows who she is, what she wants." His voice softened. "When I saw you walking to that schoolhouse, head held high despite those fool's comments, I thought to myself, there's a woman of substance, so no, I don't think you're too old. I think you're just right for me." Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a wall beginning to crumble. "You heard what they said." "I did. And I saw how you carried yourself afterward. It told me everything I needed to know about your character." At the boarding house steps, he took her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Grace. May I see you tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," she agreed, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. Over the next few weeks, Yancy became a fixture in Grace's life. He walked her to and from school most days, joined her for Sunday services at the small church, and took her on drives to see the surrounding countryside. The townsfolk quickly adjusted to seeing them together, though Grace occasionally overheard whispers about the old maid schoolteacher finally finding a man. One sunny Saturday, Yancy suggested they ride out to see the Jenkins Ranch, now the Yates Ranch, as his offer had been accepted. Grace wore her split riding skirt, a practical garment that had raised eyebrows when she first arrived in Calico, but had since been adopted by several younger women. The ranch lay 5 miles outside town, nestled in a small valley with a year-round creek providing precious water. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, weathered but sturdy. "It needs work," Yancy admitted as he helped her down from her horse. "New roof, some windows replaced, fresh paint." "It has good bones," Grace replied, admiring the wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house. Inside was dusty but promising, large rooms with high ceilings, a stone fireplace, and built-in cabinets in the kitchen. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms offered more space than Yancy would need living alone. "This would make a lovely nursery," Grace commented absently as they explored, then blushed when she realized what she'd said. Yancy didn't tease her about it. Instead, he simply took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I thought the same thing." They ate a picnic lunch by the creek, the spring sunshine warm on their faces. Grace removed her hat, letting her hair worn in a looser style than usual catch the light. "You should wear it down more often," Yancy said, reaching out to touch a curl that had escaped its pins. "A schoolteacher must maintain a certain level of decorum," Grace replied, though she made no move to pull away. "And what about when you're not being a schoolteacher?" His fingers traced the line of her jaw. "What about when you're just Grace?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Grace found herself leaning toward him, drawn by something she hadn't felt in years, perhaps had never truly felt before. "Then perhaps I might be persuaded," she whispered. His kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. When she responded, it deepened, his hand cradling the back of her head with surprising tenderness. When they broke apart, both a little breathless, Yancy rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you. Even though I'm an old maid schoolteacher," she teased, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Especially because you're a beautiful, intelligent woman who knows her own mind," he corrected her. On the ride back to town, Grace found herself imagining a different life than the one she'd resigned herself to, one that included a home of her own, a partner to share it with, perhaps even children if it wasn't too late. As May turned to June, rumors began circulating about the relationship between the schoolteacher and the rancher. Most were benign, but some were less kind, particularly from the younger cowboys who frequented the saloon. "Heard Yates is sweet on the schoolmarm," drawled one cowhand to another as Grace passed the saloon on her way to the mercantile. "Guess, when a man gets that age, he'll settle for whatever's available." "She ain't bad looking," his companion replied, "but she's pushing 35 if she's a day." Not much chance of giving him sons at that age. Grace kept walking, her back straight and her expression composed, though the words stung more than she cared to admit. She had just turned 33, but in their eyes, that might as well be ancient. Inside the mercantile, the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Henderson, greeted her warmly. "Miss Valenti, I was hoping you'd come in today. We just got a shipment of that blue calico fabric you admired last month. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, but I don't think I'll be needing it after all. Grace busied herself selecting items from her shopping list. The older woman studied her shrewdly. Don't let those young fools bother you, dear. My Harold was 43 when we married, and I was 38. 23 years and 4 children later, we're still happy as can be. Grace looked up in surprise. Mrs. Henderson had always seemed the epitome of the traditional wife and mother. Thank you, she said softly. That's reassuring to hear. That Yates fellow seems like a good man, Mrs. Henderson continued, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. Steady, hardworking, not like some who blow through town with the wind. He is, Grace agreed. Well then. Mrs. Henderson placed the coffee on the counter with a decisive thump. I think you should have 3 yards of that blue calico. It brings out your eyes something wonderful. Grace left the store with her purchases, including the fabric, feeling slightly better. Still, the Cowboy's comments lingered in her mind. Was it fair to Yancy if she couldn't give him children? Should they discuss this directly? That evening, Yancy called at the boarding house as usual, his face lighting up when he saw her. They walked to the small town park, finding a bench beneath a cottonwood tree where they could speak privately. You seem troubled, Yancy said after a few minutes of conversation. Has something happened? Grace hesitated, then decided honesty was best. I overheard some comments today about my age, about whether I could give you children. Yancy's expression darkened. Who said that? I'll have a word with them. No, Grace touched his arm. That would only make things worse. But it made me think. Perhaps we should discuss it. I'm 33, Yancy, not young by the standards of motherhood. Grace, he took her hands in his. I won't pretend I haven't thought about having a family with you. I have. But if that blessing doesn't come our way, I would still count myself the luckiest man in California to have you as my wife. Her heart stuttered at the word wife, though he hadn't formally proposed. You say that now. I say it knowing exactly what I mean, he interrupted gently. My mother was 34 when my youngest brother was born. My aunt had twins at 36. But even if we're not so fortunate, there are children who need homes, orphans from the war and the epidemics. The thought had never occurred to Grace, despite her work with children. You would consider that? I would consider anything that would make us a family, Yancy said simply. But Grace, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I haven't even properly asked you to marry me yet. She laughed, tension breaking. No, you haven't. Well, I intend to, but I want to do it right. He kissed her softly. Be patient with me a little longer. The following week brought excitement to Calico in the form of preparations for the town's Independence Day celebration. As schoolteacher, Grace was responsible for organizing the children's pageant, while Yancy had volunteered to help construct booths for games and refreshments. They saw less of each other than usual, both busy with their respective tasks, though Yancy still found time to walk her home most evenings. On July 3rd, he mentioned that he had business in San Bernardino and wouldn't be back until the following afternoon. You'll miss the morning parade, Grace said, surprised. The 4th of July celebration was a major event in Calico. Can't be helped, Yancy replied, looking genuinely regretful. But I'll be back for the pageant and fireworks. Save me a seat, of course. The Independence Day celebrations began with a parade down Main Street. Grace stood with her students, making sure they were ready for their performance later that day. She found herself scanning the crowd repeatedly, hoping Yancy might have returned early, but there was no sign of him. By mid-afternoon, the festivities were in full swing. The schoolyard had been transformed with bunting and banners, tables laden with food, and various games of skill and chance. Grace was kept busy organizing her students. her elaborate pageant depicting scenes from American history set to begin at 4 o'clock. Just as the children were lining up to process onto the makeshift stage, Grace spotted Yancy riding into town. He dismounted quickly, handing his horse off to the livery boy, and made his way toward her. "I was afraid you wouldn't make it," she said when he reached her side. "Wouldn't have missed it for the world," he replied, looking unusually nervous. "Your students look ready to shine." The pageant was a success, with the children performing their parts admirably, despite a few forgotten lines and one minor mishap involving a toppled backdrop. When it concluded with a rousing rendition of America, the audience broke into enthusiastic applause. Grace was accepting congratulations from parents when she felt a hand on her elbow. Turning, she found Yancy at her side, still with that same nervous energy about him. "Could you come with me for a moment?" he asked quietly. "I have something I need to ask you." Her heart began to race as she nodded, allowing him to lead her away from the crowd to a quieter corner of the schoolyard. To her surprise, he had brought her to the large oak tree where the children often played during recess. "I know it's not the most romantic location," Yancy said, following her gaze to the sturdy branches overhead, "but it seemed fitting somehow. This is where you spend your days teaching, shaping young minds. It's where I first saw you, standing tall and proud despite those fools' comments." He took both her hands in his. "Grace Valenti, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. I've spent years wandering, never finding a place that felt like home. Then I found you, and suddenly home wasn't a place, it was a person." With practiced grace that belied his rugged appearance, Yancy dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I love you, Grace. Your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you fight for your students, the way you stand up for what you believe in. I love the woman you are now, and the woman you'll become as we grow older together." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it revealed a ring with a modest diamond set in gold, flanked by 2 small sapphires. "Will you marry me, Grace? Will you build a life with me at the ranch, fill it with books and laughter and whatever blessings come our way?" Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Yancy Yates, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into an embrace, kissing her with such tenderness that Grace forgot they were in public view. When they broke apart, she was startled to hear applause. A small crowd had gathered at a discreet distance, including several of her students and their parents. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, beaming. "Well, it's about time. When's the wedding?" Grace looked at Yancy, suddenly realizing they hadn't discussed timing. "Soon," he said firmly. "Before the new school term begins, if that suits Miss Valenti." "That's barely 6 weeks away," Grace said, calculations racing through her mind. "Too soon?" Yancy asked, looking concerned. "No," she decided. "Not too soon at all." Word of their engagement spread quickly through Calico. Most reactions were positive, with many of the town's residents expressing delight that their respected schoolteacher had found happiness. A few of the younger cowboys who had made disparaging comments about Grace's age found themselves unwelcome at the more respectable establishments in town. A development Grace suspected was Yancy's doing, despite his denial. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparation. Grace continued teaching summer sessions for students who needed extra help, while also working with Yancy to ready the ranch house for habitation. The townswomen rallied around her, organizing sewing circles to help with her trousseau and offering advice, some welcome, some less so, about married life. Her sister Alina arrived from San Francisco 2 weeks before the wedding, bringing fashionable fabrics for a wedding dress and offering her city-honed expertise in making the ranch house comfortable. "He's quite handsome," Alina commented as they painted the kitchen cabinets a cheerful yellow. "And clearly smitten with you." "I still can't quite believe it," Grace admitted, carefully detailing the edge of a shelf. "I'd resigned myself to spinsterhood." "Nonsense. You were simply waiting for the right man." Alina dipped her brush with practiced efficiency. "Though I must say, when you wrote that you were marrying a cowboy, I had my doubts. I imagined someone much younger and considerably less substantial." "Yancy is different," Grace said, smiling at the thought of him. "He's lived enough life to know what matters." The night before the wedding, Grace found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of the changes tomorrow would bring. She would no longer be Miss Valenti, the schoolteacher, but Mrs. Yates, a rancher's wife. She would still teach. Yancy had been adamant that she continue her career if she wished, but her center of gravity would shift from the schoolhouse to the ranch. When dawn finally broke, she rose and dressed in a simple morning gown, knowing that Alina and Mrs. Wilcox would soon arrive to help her prepare. The wedding was set for 11 o'clock at the church, with a celebration to follow at the town hall. As predicted, her sister and landlady bustled in shortly after breakfast, arms laden with the wedding dress they had carefully sewn and pressed. "No sign of cold feet?" Mrs. Wilcox asked, helping Grace out of her day dress. "Not even slightly chilled," Grace replied with a smile. The wedding dress was simple but elegant ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, the skirt adorned with tiny pearl buttons that Alina had insisted on ordering from San Francisco. It fit perfectly, emphasizing Grace's slender waist and complementing her fair complexion. Alina arranged Grace's auburn hair in an elaborate style topped with a small wreath of orange blossoms. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "Positively radiant." A knock at the door revealed Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, who had agreed to escort Grace to the church in the absence of her father. "Miss Valenti," he said, his usually gruff voice soft with emotion, "you look beautiful. That young man is a fortunate fellow indeed." The church was filled to capacity when Grace arrived. She paused at the entrance, suddenly nervous despite her earlier confidence. Then the small orchestra comprised of the town's amateur musicians began playing the wedding march, and all eyes turned toward her. Grace saw only one face in the crowd, Yancy's, his amber eyes alight with love as he watched her progress down the aisle on Mr. Henderson's arm. He looked magnificent in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed, though one stubborn curl fell across his forehead in a way that made Grace want to reach out and smooth it back. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Grace remembered the weight of Yancy's hands holding hers, the sincerity in his voice as he spoke his vows, and the cool slide of the gold band onto her finger. Then the minister was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Yancy was kissing her with a restrained passion that promised more to come. The celebration afterward was joyful and boisterous, with most of the town in attendance. There was dancing and feasting, speeches and toasts, and more well wishes than Grace could possibly remember. Through it all, Yancy remained at her side, his hand often finding hers or resting lightly at the small of her back, as if reassuring himself that she was real. As evening approached, they changed into traveling clothes for the short journey to the ranch, their home now. Friends and well-wishers lined the street as they departed in Yancy's wagon, showering them with rice and cheerful calls. "Are you happy, Mrs. Yates?" Yancy asked when they were finally alone on the road to the ranch. "Completely, Mr. Yates," Grace replied, leaning against his shoulder as he guided the horses. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I have the most beautiful, intelligent, perfect wife in all of California." "Hardly perfect," Grace laughed. "Perfect for me," Yancy insisted. The ranch house, when they arrived, had been transformed from the dusty, empty building Grace had first seen. Now the windows gleamed, the floors shone with polish, and new curtains framed the views of the surrounding countryside. A small staff, a housekeeper, and 2 ranch hands had been hired to help manage the property, though they had discreetly made themselves scarce for the newlyweds' first night. Yancy insisted on carrying Grace over the threshold, a romantic gesture that made her laugh with delight. Inside, they found the table set for a simple but elegant supper, with a bottle of champagne chilling in a bucket of ice. Eleanor's touch, Grace suspected. Later, as moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, Grace discovered that Yancy's tenderness extended to the most intimate aspects of marriage. His hands, roughened by years of outdoor work, touched her with exquisite gentleness, his kisses both reverent and passionate. When they finally became one, Grace felt as if she'd found a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. "I love you," Yancy whispered against her skin as they lay entwined afterward. "My beautiful Grace." "And I love you," she replied, marveling at the path that had brought them together. The weeks following the wedding were a time of adjustment and discovery. Grace learned the rhythms of ranch life while continuing to teach, riding to and from town each day on a gentle mare Yancy had selected for her. Yancy worked from sunrise to sunset most days, building his herd and improving the property, but always made time for Grace in the evenings. They established traditions, quickly reading aloud to each other after supper, Sunday picnics by the creek when weather permitted, star-gazing from the porch on clear nights. Grace discovered that Yancy had a talent for woodworking, creating beautiful furniture for their home in his spare time. Yancy learned that Grace had a surprisingly fine singing voice, though she was too shy to perform for anyone but him. As summer turned to fall, Grace began to notice changes in her body, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Her monthly cycle, always regular as clockwork, failed to appear. Certain scents that had never bothered her before suddenly turned her stomach. Her breasts became tender, her waistband snug. She said nothing to Yancy, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed. But when she missed a second monthly cycle, she made an appointment with Dr. Porter during her lunch hour at school. The doctor confirmed what Grace had begun to suspect. She was expecting a child, likely to arrive in early spring. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace took Yancy's hand and placed it gently over her still flat abdomen. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. Yancy stared at her for a moment, then at his hand on her stomach, his expression shifting from confusion to wonder to pure joy. "A baby," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "You're sure?" Dr. Porter confirmed it today. "He thinks the baby will come in April." Yancy gathered her into his arms with a whoop of delight that startled the horses in the nearby corral. "Grace, my love, my darling wife." He kissed her soundly, then more gently. "Are you happy? Are you feeling well? Should you be resting? Do you need anything?" Grace laughed at his barrage of questions. "Yes, yes, no, and just you," she answered. "I'm perfectly fine, Yancy. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my wife, not my baby." His hand returned to her abdomen, protective and wondering. "I can't believe it. A family of our own." The news of Grace's pregnancy spread quickly through Calico, met with genuine delight from most quarters. A few of the Cowboys who had doubted her ability to bear children found themselves facing Yancy's cold stare when they ventured congratulations, but Grace encouraged him to be gracious in victory. "They were wrong about me, about us," she said. "That's satisfaction enough." As her body changed to accommodate their growing child, Grace continued teaching, though she agreed to reduce her hours slightly at Yancy's insistent concern for her well-being. The school board, composed primarily of parents who respected Grace deeply, were supportive of the arrangement. Winter in the high desert brought cold nights and occasional snow, but the ranch house remained warm and cozy. Yancy added a nursery adjoining their bedroom, painting it himself in soft yellows and greens. He spent hours crafting a cradle from oak, carving delicate leaves and vines along its edges. "It's beautiful," Grace said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "You're a true artist, Yancy." "Just a man who loves his wife and wants the best for his child," he replied modestly, though she could see he was pleased by her praise. In late January, a blizzard swept through the region, dropping 3 feet of snow in a single day. The ranch was isolated for nearly a week, the roads to town impassable. Grace, now visibly pregnant, found herself enjoying the forced seclusion with Yancy. They read together, played chess, and talked for hours about their hopes for their child. "What shall we name the baby?" Grace asked one evening as they sat before the fire, her feet in Yancy's lap as he massaged them gently. "I thought perhaps William if it's a boy after my father," Yancy suggested. "Or Elizabeth for a girl after your mother, William Yates." "Elizabeth Yates." Grace tested the names aloud. "They both have a nice sound." "We could call her Eliza for short," Yancy mused, his hand moving to caress Grace's rounded belly. "Little Eliza Yates." As if in response, the baby kicked sharply, causing both parents to laugh in delight. "I think he or she approves," Grace said. Spring arrived early that year, with March bringing warm breezes and wildflowers across the ranch. Grace's time grew near, and Dr. Porter began making weekly visits to check on her progress. "Everything looks excellent, Mrs. Yates," he reassured her after each examination. "You're in fine health, and the baby is developing perfectly." Despite these reassurances, Yancy grew increasingly anxious as the expected date approached. He hired additional help for the ranch so he could remain closer to home, and he read every medical text he could find regarding childbirth. "You're going to worry yourself sick," Grace told him one evening as he pored over a medical journal. "Women have been doing this for millennia, Yancy." "I know," he admitted, setting the book aside. "I just can't bear the thought of anything happening to you or the baby." "Nothing is going to happen," she said with more confidence than she felt. Childbirth was always a risk, especially for a first-time mother of her age, but dwelling on potential dangers served no purpose. On the morning of April 12, 1879, Grace woke to a sharp pain across her abdomen. When a second followed 20 minutes later, she gently shook Yancy awake. "I think it's time," she said calmly. "The baby is coming." What followed was a day of pain unlike anything Grace had experienced, but also of profound connection with Yancy, who refused to leave her side despite Dr. Porter's initial objections. The doctor eventually relented, allowing Yancy to remain in the room, holding Grace's hand and whispering encouragement as she labored to bring their child into the world. As sunset painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Grace gave a final, powerful push, and their son entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to both parents' eyes. "A boy," Dr. Porter announced, quickly cleaning and swaddling the infant. "A fine, healthy boy." He placed the tiny bundle in Grace's arms, and she gazed down at their son's red, wrinkled face with a love so fierce it took her breath away. Yancy perched on the edge of the bed, one arm around Grace's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's cheek. "William," Grace whispered. "Hello, William Yates. We've been waiting for you." "He's perfect," Yancy said, his voice thick with emotion. just like his mother. In the days that followed, Grace and Yancy adjusted to life with their newborn son. William, called Will by his adoring father, proved to have a healthy appetite and strong lungs, keeping his parents awake for much of each night. "I never knew it was possible to be so exhausted and so happy at the same time," Grace commented one morning as she nursed Will while Yancy brought her breakfast in bed. "You're amazing," Yancy said, watching them with evident pride. "Both of you." By summer, life had settled into a new rhythm. Grace took a leave of absence from teaching to focus on motherhood, though she planned to return part-time when Will was a bit older. The ranch prospered under Yancy's careful management, with the cattle herd growing and the first crop of foals from his breeding program showing promise. On warm evenings, they would sit together on the porch swing, while sleeping peacefully in Grace's arms or gurgling happily on Yancy's lap. They talked of the future, of siblings for Will, of the kind of life they wanted to build together. "I never thought I could be this content," Yancy said one such evening as the setting sun bathed everything in golden light. "When I rode into Calico that day, I was looking for a place to settle, maybe find a wife someday. I never expected to find everything I ever wanted. And I had convinced myself that some dreams weren't meant for me," Grace replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "That I was too old, that my chance had passed." "Those cowboys were fools," Yancy said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You weren't too old. You were exactly right." Will chose that moment to wake, demanding attention with a cry that quickly turned to smiles when he saw his parents' faces. As Grace adjusted her shawl to feed him, Yancy wrapped his arm around them both, creating a circle of love and protection. "Our perfect little family," he murmured. "Just the beginning," Grace replied, knowing in her heart that their story was still unfolding, each day bringing new joys and challenges to face together. As the years passed, the Yates family grew and flourished. Grace returned to teaching part-time when Will was 2, bringing him with her to the schoolhouse where he charmed students and parents alike. When Will was 3, he was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, called Eliza as planned, who inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's amber eyes. The ranch expanded as Yancy's reputation for quality horses spread throughout California. He built a larger barn, added more grazing land, and hired additional hands to help manage the growing operation. Grace kept the books, her mathematical skills proving invaluable as the business grew more complex. 2 years after Eliza's birth, Grace gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, named Henry and Hannah, completing their family with joyful chaos. The house that had once seemed too large for two now rang with children's laughter and the busy sounds of family life. When the children were old enough for formal schooling, Grace became the principal of Calico's expanded school, overseeing 3 teachers and implementing a curriculum that was considered progressive for its time. Her students consistently performed well on county examinations, many going on to further education in San Bernardino or even San Francisco. Yancy took pride in Grace's professional accomplishments, never treating her career as secondary to his own. They were partners in every sense, supporting each other's endeavors and presenting a united front in both parenting and community affairs. The Cowboys, who had once dismissed Grace as too old for marriage, occasionally passed through Calico in the years that followed. Some, humbled by time and experience, offered sincere if belated congratulations. Others maintained their distance, perhaps uncomfortable facing the living evidence of their poor judgment. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Yancy and Grace hosted a celebration at the ranch. Family and friends gathered from near and far, their children, now young adults, former students, ranching associates, and the many people whose lives they had touched over the years. Will, at 24, had followed in his father's footsteps, managing a section of the ranch dedicated to breeding exceptional quarter horses. Eliza, 21, was completing her education at a women's college in the East, planning to return to California to teach. The twins, 19, were finding their own paths. Henry apprenticed to a veterinarian in San Bernardino, Hannah showing remarkable talent as an artist. As the celebration wound down and guests departed, Yancy led Grace to their favorite spot by the creek, where a bench now sat beneath the cottonwood trees they had planted in their first year of marriage. 25 years, Yancy said, taking her hand as they sat together in the dappled sunlight. The best 25 years any man could ask for. Grace studied his face, still handsome though now lined with the evidence of years spent working outdoors. His hair had silvered at the temples, matching the strands of gray in her own auburn locks. They had aged, certainly, but together each change witnessed and treasured by the other. "You ever think about those cowboys?" Grace asked, a teasing light in her eyes. "The ones who thought I was too old for marriage." Yancy laughed, the same gap-toothed smile that had first charmed her all those years ago. "Occasionally. Usually when I'm counting my blessings." "Counting your blessings?" "Yes," he said, lifting her hand to his lips, "because their foolishness was my good fortune. If they had seen what I saw in you, I might have had competition." "There was never any competition," Grace assured him. "From the moment you walked me home from the schoolhouse, my heart was yours." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Yancy and Grace remained by the creek, talking quietly of memories shared and dreams still to fulfill. Their children would find them there later, still hand in hand, still leaning toward each other as if drawn by an invisible force. And in Calico, where a rough-hewn cowboy had once declared a schoolteacher just right, despite what others thought, their story became something of a legend, a reminder that love comes in its own time, in its own way, seeing what others miss and lasting when others fade. For Grace and Yancy Yates, it was simply the life they had built together, one day at a time, proving with each sunrise and sunset that the heart knows what it wants, regardless of what the world might say. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both expected and surprising. When Grace reached her 60th birthday, she retired from her position as school principal, though she continued to tutor students who needed extra help. Yancy, at 64, gradually handed more responsibility for the ranch to Will, though he remained actively involved in breeding decisions and business strategy. Their children had given them 7 grandchildren by then, bright and curious little ones who loved nothing more than spending time at the big ranch with Grandma and Grandpa. Grace taught them to read and bake and identify wildflowers. Yancy showed them how to ride and fish and whittle small animals from scraps of wood. "We're blessed beyond measure," Grace often said as they watched the grandchildren play in the same creek where they had once picnicked as newlyweds. "We made this," Yancy would reply, his arm around her shoulders. "Together." On quiet evenings, they still sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset just as they had in those early days. Their conversation flowed as easily as ever, sometimes looking back, more often looking forward. "Do you have any regrets?" Yancy asked her once as they approached their 30th anniversary. "Anything you wish had been different?" Grace considered the question carefully, as was her way. "I sometimes wonder what might have happened if you'd ridden into Calico earlier, or if I'd come west sooner. We might have had more years together. Or we might not have been ready for each other," Yancy pointed out. "You needed time to become the woman you are, and heaven knows I needed those years to gain enough sense to recognize a treasure when I found one." A treasure, Grace laughed. At 32, with spectacles and practical shoes. The most valuable treasure in California, Yancy insisted, kissing her soundly to emphasize his point. Worth more than all the silver in the Calico mines. As they entered their 7th decade of life, Calico itself began to change. The silver mines that had brought the town into existence were producing less, and many of the original buildings had been abandoned or repurposed. But the Yates Ranch remained a constant, its prosperity a testament to Yancy's business acumen and their joint hard work. They had expanded beyond horses and cattle to include orchards and vegetable gardens that supplied much of the surrounding area. The ranch employed dozens of workers, many of whom had been with them for years, almost like extended family. When they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, 4 generations of the family gathered at the ranch. Will had married and had 3 children of his own, the oldest of whom had recently made him a grandfather. Eliza had become a respected educator, establishing a progressive school in San Bernardino. The twins had found their niches as well, Henry as a veterinarian with a thriving practice, Hannah as an artist whose paintings of Western landscapes hung in galleries from San Francisco to New York. The celebration was a multi-day affair, with friends traveling from across the country to honor the couple whose love story had inspired so many. There was music and dancing, feasting and storytelling, and at the center of it all, Grace and Yancy, now in their 80s but still clearly devoted to one another. During a quiet moment, their first great-grandchild, a curious 5-year-old named Sarah, approached them where they sat together beneath a decorated arbor. "Grandpa Great?" she asked, using the name the youngest generation had bestowed on Yancy. "How did you know you loved Grandma Great?" Yancy chuckled, exchanging a warm glance with Grace. "Well, little one, I knew the moment I saw her walking tall and proud down the street in Calico, not caring what anyone thought. But she was old then," Sarah said innocently, repeating something she must have overheard. "Not old," Yancy corrected gently. "Just right. Just exactly right for me." Grace reached for his hand, her fingers still fitting perfectly between his despite the changes time had wrought on both their bodies. "And he was just right for me," she added. "Sometimes it takes a while to find the person who sees you exactly as you are and loves you because of it, not despite it." Sarah nodded solemnly, as if filing this wisdom away for future reference, then skipped off to rejoin her cousins in a game. 50 years, Grace mused when they were alone again. "It seems impossible." "And yet not nearly long enough," Yancy replied. 3 years later, Yancy fell ill with pneumonia in the winter of his 89th year. Despite the best medical care available, including a specialist brought from Los Angeles, his condition deteriorated rapidly. Grace never left his side, sleeping in a chair beside their bed when he insisted she rest. Their children and grandchildren gathered, filling the ranch house with subdued conversation and the occasional burst of laughter when someone shared a particularly fond memory. On a clear February morning with sunlight streaming through the bedroom window, Yancy opened his eyes and found Grace's gaze. "Hello, beautiful," he whispered, his voice weak but his smile as warm as ever. "Hello, my love," she replied, taking his hand. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about that day in Calico. Best decision I ever made walking you home from the schoolhouse." "Best decision I ever made letting you," Grace answered, her voice steady despite the tears threatening. "You'll be all right," Yancy said, not a question but a statement of faith in her strength. "Promise me you'll keep finding joy." "I promise," Grace said, knowing what he was asking. "But don't go just yet. Stay with me a little longer." He squeezed her hand, the gesture feeble but intentional. Always with you, Grace. Always. Yancy slipped away peacefully that afternoon, surrounded by the family he and Grace had built together. Grace mourned deeply but privately, finding solace in the continued life of the ranch and the growing branches of their family tree. In the years that followed, she became the family storyteller, the keeper of memories, sharing tales of Yancy and their life together with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She remained active in the community, establishing a scholarship fund for promising students and supporting the preservation of Calico's historic buildings. When visitors asked about the secret to her long, fulfilling life, Grace would smile and say, "Find someone who looks at you and says, 'You're just right for me,' even when others can't see it. Then spend every day trying to be worthy of that faith." In her 95th year, on a warm April day much like the one when William had been born, Grace sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching her great-grandchildren play. She felt unusually tired but content, her mind full of memories that seemed as fresh as yesterday. That night, she dreamed of Yancy not as he had been at the end, but as the strong, vibrant cowboy who had walked into her life in Calico. In the dream, he held out his hand to her, his amber eyes twinkling with that familiar light. "Ready for a new adventure, Grace?" he asked. She placed her hand in his, feeling the perfect fit that had never changed. "With you, always." Grace Valenti Yates passed peacefully in her sleep that night, leaving behind a legacy of love that spanned generations and a story that continued to be told in Calico, and beyond the tale of a schoolteacher whom some thought too old for marriage, and the cowboy wise enough to know better. Their ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations, a living testament to what can grow from a single moment of recognition between two souls who saw in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it. And in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, their headstones stood side by side, bearing the simple inscription they had chosen together years before: Yancy and Grace Yates, not too young, not too old, but just right for each other forever.